Morning, everyone. We're just waiting a couple more minutes. We had quite a few more that registered, so we're just waiting to see if they are going to join us. But if not, either way, Liz will get started in another minute or so. All right, Liz, I think we can get started.
All righty then. Thanks, Sabrina.
Sure.
Good morning. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for being here for our this next first of 2021 series of webinars from Capital CFO. Whose job is it anyway? Navigating the relationship between the nonprofit board and chief executive. We're going to get started. If I can advance my screen. Why am I not advancing? Okay.
There it goes.
There it goes. Again, it's the first webinar. We're getting organized. So I'm Liz Chipman. I work with Sabrina here at Capital CFO. Katie Stair is also here. She'll be working on the behind the scenes, helping us move along here. And Sabrina is also here, owner of Capital CFO. We're glad to have you all here. And before we get started, I thought we'd do a little housekeeping, and I'm going to let Katie talk to you about the housekeeping.
Sure. So if you happen to be calling in by phone, you can feel free to email questions to me. My email address is Katie, Katie, at capitalcfollc.com. This is also useful if you get disconnected and you can't reconnect. Any technical difficulties, you can reach out to me in the chat box. And we also accept questions and comments in the chat box at any time during the presentation. And finally, we are recording this session and it will be made available afterward. We will email it out as well as post it on our website. So you'll be able to revisit any of the content if you're not able to take notes right now. And like we said, any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We will make sure they get addressed either throughout the presentation, or if not, we will follow up at the end during the question and answer session.
Thanks, Katie. And then again, this webinar is one of a series put on by Capital CFO. And now I'm going to let Sabrina talk a little bit to you all about Capital CFO, as she is the founder and owner of Capital CFO.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Liz. So we are an outsourced nonprofit and CFO business. So we outsource bookkeepers and chief financial officers for companies and nonprofits that need the expertise, just not necessarily full-time. We also offer recruitment to help companies hire. We are not a staffing agency, so we don't do it in reverse. We don't help find people positions, but Liz is actually recruitment specialist with Capital CFO, and we do help people with finding positions within their company. And finally, in 2019, the three of us started working together on consulting services for nonprofits that go above and beyond the CFO work that we do. And one of our last slides in the presentation kind of lists out a lot of our services that we offer. So we'll be sure to go over those at the end.
Thanks, Sabrina. So here now we'll come to the subject that we're all here to talk about this morning. Whose job is it anyway? Navigating the relationship between the nonprofit board and the chief executive. And why do we even need to answer or ask that question? It seems to come up a lot. It seems to be an issue for the nonprofit sector. In most private sector organizations, there's a clear job description, there's a clear hierarchy, who supervises whom, what duties are for each particular job, but it seems to be oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, there's this sometimes unclarity or confusion about what is the job of the nonprofit board and the board members and chief executive, and there's sometimes some conflict there. So that's what we're here to talk about today. One of the things that contributes to this, and I just want to remind everybody, nonprofit organization is complicated. right? I've got a kind of a sample org chart here. You've got a volunteer, a group of volunteers, part-time volunteers, board of directors at the very top of the organizational chart who oversee and manage hired professional staff. That's the executive director. And then you oftentimes might have another group of volunteers, that advisory board on the side that work in some capacity to advise and inform the work of the executive director and the board. And then below that, you've got more paid staff that is supervised by the executive director. And then you might even have another group of volunteers working in your organization. There's a lot going on in a nonprofit organization, and there's a lot of, everyone has come together to make social impact of some kind. You've got people that believe very passionately in the mission of the organization, and you're working to do some oftentimes very difficult stuff. You're moving social change. Or you're working in a sector either with, it could be anything from the arts to wildlife, animals, animal rescue, to working with people that need some kind of, you try to do social impact and affect change, homelessness, addiction, all these kind of child development, all kinds of really complicated social and human impacts that you're trying to make. So no wonder that we run into problems, no wonder. It's very complicated. Here's some of the things that play into it, I think, particularly between the executive director or the chief. You'll hear me use the term executive director and chief executive interchangeably here, but we just mean the head, the chief executive officer in the nonprofit organization. Executive director doesn't report to a single boss, but legally to an entire board, and that can be anywhere from 5 to 25 people, right? It's complicated. The board of directors are volunteers. They're not there every day. They might have come on to the board because they have a specific skill set and also because they believe in the mission of the organization, but they don't necessarily have specific human resources training, which can make supervising the executive director complicated. Many EDs never receive formal feedback from the board, so that leaves them kind of to sort out strategic priorities on their own. And oftentimes problems arise when the board thinks the executive director should be focusing on something else. And on the flip side, boards of directors rely on the executive director as a conduit of information, both about the organization and about staff. And if the ED chooses not to share the information that the board needs, this can leave the board unable to make decisions or make them vulnerable to not having enough information. And then sometimes EDs don't want to share information or are feeling vulnerable themselves and don't share information with the board that they should. And sometimes they feel they know better than the board. So there's sometimes a power struggle there, and the board only knows what the ED shares with them. So there's lots of stuff going on. These are some of the reasons that things can get complicated. So the way that we're going to approach this today, I'll talk about board roles and responsibilities, chief executive roles and responsibilities, and then we'll talk about those areas where tension or blurred lines sometimes occur. And if you have any questions or comments throughout, please put them in the chat box and we'll try to address them as they come up. So first I'd like to kind of get a handle on who we've got in the room, so to speak. What your role is at your agency. So I'm going to put up a little poll here, and if I'll give you a few minutes to enter what your role is at your agency. A lot of board members, it looks like.
And it looks like we have one person joining by phone, so I think that's going to be it.
Okay, great. So board members, and we've got an executive director here too. Great, good. Right, so we'll try to obviously look at it from both sides here. All right, so we'll talk about board roles and responsibilities first. So board responsibilities fall into this big, often vague term called governance, but there are kind of 4 specific buckets that board responsibilities fall into. There's legal oversight, and this just means that the board ensures that the agency is operating in accordance with its mission and the purpose for which it was granted non-exempt, nonprofit, tax-exempt status. That means developing bylaws and following those bylaws. You safeguard the public trust. You want to ensure that monies are stewarded properly, and that the organization is protecting financial assets and legal and ethical integrity and accountability. The second kind of bucket is management oversight, and this is management specifically of the executive director, not program staff or agency staff, but the executive director. So that means hiring, managing the executive director, evaluating the executive director, and when necessary, terminating the executive director. The third bucket, financial oversight, you're going to approve the annual budget, hire an auditor, and ensure that there are financial resources for the organization. And then program oversight is the last one, and that is ensuring that the programs that are in place further the mission and the goals of the organization. So that's really it. There's 4 big buckets within that governance area for the board. And then the executive director, or the chief executive. So the board is the steers the ship. Often the metaphors use that they're the captain of the ship, steering it in the right direction. And the executive director is the one that puts that strategic objectives of the strategic oversight in place. They operationalize everything. They're the boots on the ground. If the board is the oversight and setting the direction, the executive director is, as I said, the actual boots on the ground making it happen. So the buckets for the executive director, staff management. So they're the ones that hire, manage, and evaluate and terminate when necessary the program staff or the operational staff. Development and management of policies and programs. They manage to the budget. So if the board approves the budget and sets the budget for the organization, the executive director within that budget manages programs and all expenses to that budget, and they bring the strategic plan to life. The board helps build the strategic plan and approves the strategic plan for the organization, and the executive director is the one that makes it happen. And the executive director is also the staff liaison to the board of directors. So they keep the board informed of what the organization is doing, attends board meetings, and maintains open lines of communication with the board of directors. Okay. And then in addition to those 2 buckets, the governance and then the operational, which is the executive director, governance, which is the board, there are some shared responsibilities of the board and the executive director. That's strategic planning. They should both be involved in the strategic planning process. Although ultimately, it is the board's purview to approve the strategic plan and for the executive director to make it operational. They both should be involved in the planning process. Putting together a fundraising plan is also a shared responsibility. Developing the budget for the organization, although again, it's the board's purview to approve that budget ultimately, and it is the executive director's purview to manage that budget over the course of the fiscal year. And then evaluation of the organization is something that is jointly done by the executive director and the board. So we've got those nice lists that I showed you, right? We've got the board of directors governance buckets, and then we've got the chief executive or the executive director's kind of operational buckets, and then shared. So why do we still have oftentimes this kind of tension between the board and the executive director? What makes that happen? So here's a couple of nice quotes that I find resonate with me. Almost all board problems can be traced to the confusion of governance with management. Okay, although here's the governance things over here, here's management. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between the two. And then the other quote that I like is 99% of problems between executive directors and boards come from a lack of clear definition of roles and responsibilities, people making assumptions about their work or not complying with these defined roles. And again, I refer you back to the organizational chart for nonprofit organizations. It's complicated, all right? So I think up front, I think we should give ourselves, all of us who work in the nonprofit sector, forgive ourselves a little bit for when tensions do arise or difficulties do arise, because sometimes it is hard to figure out who's stepping on whose toes, or and sometimes assumptions are made, and then you throw volunteers both down in the organization, and then again advisory boards or boards of directors to it. It does really get complicated. So let's talk about some of the specific things that can cause this kind of tension. And then we'll give you some strategies and some tools to help mitigate that when it does occur. So what does this tension sometimes look like? I think it's might be helpful to look at that a little bit. So here's just some examples, and some of these might sound familiar to some of you who are here this morning. Board perspective. The executive director gets so defensive when I ask her for something. And then the executive director perspective, the board is questioning everything I do. The executive director won't let us exercise proper fiscal oversight. That's what the board feels like. And the executive director, on the other hand, is like, I can't even order stationery without the board wanting to get involved. So you can see, and the reality is that our perspective is our reality. So board member asking for information feels like they're justified, and they may very well be justified in asking for that information. And the executive director feels like you don't trust what he or she is doing. A lot of it comes down to clear communication and to everybody understanding what their roles are. So let's talk a little bit about how we can help make that happen. So one of the reasons that tensions sometimes happen is lack of information or lack of clarity. For example, and in that quote that I showed you just a little while ago, board members are unclear about the difference between governance and management. So part of this is that governance can be kind of a vague, hard to wrap your mind around kind of concept. Management issues are more familiar to most people, things like concrete tasks, hiring people, managing a project, editing the newsletter. They're easier to understand than more these kind of conceptual activities like setting policy or strategizing or exercising oversight. So it's much easier a lot of times for people, board members, to kind of gravitate toward these more concrete things. And then on the other hand, the ED or the chief executive can sometimes be unclear about the role of the board. So they might interpret requests for information as a lack of trust, and we just mentioned this too, a lack of trust in their competence, a lack of respect or a lack of appreciation for his or her work, right? They don't always understand the board's responsibilities, and they can get resentful of board members who ask for information that they legitimately need for oversight. So that's another area where tensions can happen. And then the other thing that sometimes happens is board members don't have a clear understanding of the scope of the organization's work or the day-to-day management. And this sometimes goes back to the board members may not have gotten a good orientation to the organization when they were brought onto the board. And again, relying on the the executive director to be the single conduit of information. So they might not have a clear understanding about the programs, the environment in which the organization is operating, and don't have time, because oftentimes board members have full-time jobs outside their volunteer work with the organization, right? They've got full-time jobs, day jobs of their own. So they don't take the time to learn about the organization on their own. So they might lack the information they need to provide adequate oversight in their governance role. So it may, they may ask for information that the ED feels that they should already know, and it might feel like they're challenging the executive director without taking time and to understand the context in which they're operating. So lack of information and lack of clarity are two big ones. And then the other thing that can cause tensions to happen between board and the chief executive are any kind of change or transition. One of the big ones is the shift from being a working board, what we call a working board, or an all volunteer organization, to hiring a chief executive. Many small nonprofits start out as an all volunteer organization where the board are doing are not only acting as the board of directors, but also doing all the work in the organization. We've had consultations actually in the last couple of weeks with a couple of organizations like that. They're just getting started. They've gotten chartered, but the work's being all done by the board. And then as that organization grows and it becomes evident that the board all these volunteers cannot do all the work of the organization, they look to hiring a chief executive. And when that happens, when you have paid staff working for a board that has been accustomed to doing all the work themselves, sometimes that transition is really hard of separating those roles. Excuse me, just had to clear my throat. The other thing that can cause tensions, another type of change, is when you transition to a new executive director, a new chief executive is hired. If there's been there may have been a transition period between executive directors where the board had to take on more hands-on role, and it might be difficult to go back to assuming a fully governance board role after they've had to fill in or take care of stuff, or the new chief executive might need some time to get up to speed or feel confident in their role. And the board may take over some of the things that are more rightly the executive director's role, and that can be a difficult transition as well. And then the other kind of change that can happen is if there's some kind of change in the shift of the organization, in their mission, or the needs of the organization change, or the needs are unclear. And certainly, I would say the last year now with COVID-19 has caused this type of shift or change. A lot of organizations have had to pivot and change or adjust their program or change their service delivery model or their fundraising practices. And this can cause tension when people are unsure of the change that the organization needs, and roles can become muddied again. It might be the ED feels pressure to do things that were not part of what he or she signed up for, however, when they first came on, and they don't feel confident to take on new roles, and this can just cause tension. And then the other thing, another thing that sometimes causes tension and confusion about roles is if board practices are not in place to support the governance role of the board. If board members are unclear of their role and they lack focus, so if people don't know where to look, they focus on the first thing that they see, right? So an example of that is maybe a board member with no financial training. If there's a deficit in the budget, they're going to hone in on something like postage or something like that in the budget. It's because it's the first thing that they see, and it's something concrete that they can attach onto. And also, if a board member doesn't have a clear understanding of what they should be doing, but they still want to be involved, they often grab onto something familiar and try to exercise authority in that area. And that's, again, where that it might be easier to latch on to specific concrete tasks like editing the newsletter or deciding on stationery, because that's easier to do when you're not sure what you should be doing. The next big thing that I've seen a lot in my experience is if there's no appropriate mechanism in place to evaluate the chief executive, this can lead to problems. If you don't have agreed upon measures and a defined process to evaluate the executive director's performance, board members can only rely on subjective judgments. And if there's no structured way for the board to give feedback to the executive director, concerns about performance may be expressed in any number of counterproductive ways. So that's one really important thing, that if you don't have a mechanism in place to evaluate the chief executive, I would recommend that as one of the first things that you tackle as a board. And then the other thing that often leads to difficulties is if there's no protocol in place to communicate board priorities and decisions to the chief executive. So if there's no established and agreed upon communication protocols, for example, meeting with the board chair weekly, or checking in by phone weekly with the board chair, I'll just give that as an example. It may give the executive director the feeling that they're reporting to 26 separate bosses rather than one board of directors. So if there's an individual board member that makes a request of the executive director, and I've seen it happen where a board member might even make a request of a staff member other than the executive director. So the executive director feels like they have to respond separately to individual board members rather than responding to the board as a whole, and not understanding that requests or conversations with individual board members are just that and not necessarily a directive from the board. So that's really important as well. And then the other reason that that tension sometimes arises is that sometimes there just is. There might be just incompatibility in approaches or personalities. The first, one of the biggest ones that can be a problem is if the executive director or the chief executive is resistant to oversight and accountability to the board. The executive director, as we said, has to manage staff, figure out how to achieve program goals, raise money, balance the budget, represent the organization to the outside world. And those are just the formal roles, right? So it's a lot of responsibility. And they do need freedom and flexibility to make decisions based on their professional experience, but they can be sometimes resentful of a board that wants to supervise them, rightly or wrongly. And again, the executive director is the only information conduit that boards have. I was the interim executive director, for example, for an organization that did transportation and nursing services and stuff. And I went in after as an interim after the longtime executive director had retired. And I was very surprised at how little the board of directors knew about what actual financial shape and organizational shape the organization was in. And it was because the longtime executive director had held everything very closely to her and given them only the information that she wanted to give them, because she wanted to do things the way she was doing them and hold things together long enough for her to retire, in my opinion. So they didn't know. So once I started giving them information, then a lot of decisions were made. But it was very clear that the board only knows what they are given from the executive director. So if they don't ask the right questions or don't ask for specific information when they need it, there's no way for them to get it. So that can be a problem. The other issue on the other side that sometimes causes tension is that Board members sometimes exercise power inappropriately. Some board members may take advantage of their oversight role and use it as an excuse to be the boss. This can translate into demanding inappropriate or unnecessarily information in an unreasonable time frame. And there's also, I've seen sometimes happens, board members can require excessive hand-holding, request frequent phone or in-person meetings with the executive director. And again, if there's not kind of a protocol in place for these kinds of meetings or information or communication from the board, then the executive director can really feel like they're being, pecked to death by baby ducks. So again, a very strong board orientation can help some of that. And perhaps a mentorship relationship with a more senior board member to new board members, that kind of thing. And then the last thing that sometimes results in tension is just, sometimes personalities clash. Sometimes it just comes down to the fact that the executive director and one or more board members just can't get along. And, that's unfortunate. I think that's probably one of the more difficult ones to mitigate. Okay, so what are some of the things, does anybody have any, before I move on to kind of how we might be able to tackle some of these things and some tools that might work, is there any questions or comments that we can?
We have no questions in the
Okay.
chat this time.
Okay. So some tools, specific tools that can work to address some of these things are their board self-assessment. I think this is a really good tool to clarify roles and responsibilities, and we will give you examples of most of these, and Ken, if you reach out after the webinar, can talk more about any of these if you would like, and give you more examples of them for you to adapt to your own agency. But one of the things that is really useful, and I know Sabrina used this with her board at least on an annual basis, and I do currently with my board of directors, is board self-assessment. It's one way to clarify roles and responsibilities, and you can work on areas of weakness perhaps that you might need to strengthen up, and it helps you see where you might have policies or protocols that are not in place. So usually the self-assessment is done with a questionnaire that asks board members to rate the board on how well you as a board are fulfilling your governing functions. And it's a good discussion starter, and it's a good way to see gaps and places where you might need to strengthen in your role as a governance body. And then another thing, and again, we'll give you an example of this, is there's a nice kind of a quiz of board, ED, and staff roles. It just lists a role, and you put, is that a board role, ED role, or staff role? And if everybody does it, including the executive director and all board members, it's another really good point of discussion and a way to talk about to get clarity on who is responsible for what and what you are responsible for together. Another really useful tool, and this can be wrapped into board orientation and also when you're recruiting board members and talking to folks about possible board service, is a board member job description. Again, it's very helpful just to lend clarity, let people know what they're signing up for when they agree to take a board seat. And then job descriptions for board officers also. I know this is really helpful for my board, very young board, inexperienced board. These were very helpful. The other thing that is very helpful is to look at your board meeting agendas and your structure. I find too often board meetings are made up of reports from the executive director and staff, and discussions center on the details of implementation, program implementation, and management stuff. And it's no wonder that board members start to focus on matters that belong to management, because that's all they hear about in the board meetings. So to change the focus of board meetings, the executive director and the board chair or the executive committee need to work together to identify strategic issues and questions that are facing the organization. If you want your board to focus on governance, then those meetings, board meetings, should be about governance, matters of governance and oversight. And then, as I mentioned before, one of the really most important things I think that you can have to clarify and to help manage clear communication and functioning of the chief executive board relationship is to have a really good, robust chief executive evaluation criteria and protocol in place. You should agree on what the executive director will be held accountable for and how he or she will be evaluated. Establish annual goals worked on together. The board and board chair or the board and the executive director should work together to establish annual goals. Agree on who will evaluate the executive director's performance. Is it going to be the board chair who will then solicit input from the rest of the board? How is that going to happen? And then have a mechanism for feedback during the year. The first time the executive director hears about a problem or concern should not be at their annual performance review. Should not be a surprise. So those are the big things. And again, we'll give you samples of these or templates of these for you to use in your own agency at the end of the webinar. Now I thought maybe we'd go through a couple of scenarios just to give you some examples of how this kind of tension between the board and the executive director can sometimes manifest. It might kind of help you reflect on your own agency and your own roles within your agency. And then happy to take examples from anyone. You can put it in the chat box and we can talk about it. And maybe Katie and Sabrina and I can offer some insight, or there might be some good insights from the other folks here at the webinar that can help you navigate a particular situation if you have a concern currently for your agency. So here's just a couple of examples. I'm in a group, a Facebook group of executive directors, and every once in a while, someone will, come up with a BOD vent, a board vent. And here, this one on the left is from an executive director who had just finished, as you can see, a virtual auction gala, supposedly a board-led event, and went great. And they need to get the winners' items to them. She had a nice system for folks to come do that. And then she put out a request to the board, 17 people on the board. She put a request out for help, and she only heard back from one person. So you can see she's got in quotes here a working board. This certainly seems like a working board task, but she's very frustrated at this particular moment. So I think this reflects breakdown of communication. It also reflects that we're in a really difficult time right now. You can see we've got, people quarantining for COVID. This may have been a switch to a virtual auction, right, because of COVID-19. It may be an event that has been in person in years past. So there's another change too. So there's a lot of discombobulation going on here, but this is clearly very frustrating on the executive director's part, and the board may not be even aware that she is this frustrated or that she feels like they're disengaged or not involved. And then the one on the right is another example. This is an example of that kind of transition that to a new executive director that was mentioned in one of the series of slides that I showed. So when this executive director first started, she was so green. The board really held my hand and was very hands-on. But then once she was 2 years in, she started to feel like she had her feet under her. And it was very tricky on how to navigate, how to establish my roles versus their roles. And below there are some of the things that the board uh, did during that kind of initial period when she was a new executive director, talking about what envelopes to order, when our events were, how they should be run, who we hired, which is clearly an executive director function, how we did our billing, again, executive director function, invitations and what they looked like, how many weekly meetings the executive director put on her calendar, and the board had to review every grant application before it was submitted. So definitely the board getting down into management and operational things. Again, a lot of times that's just more, it's more concrete, and it's very easy to drift that way if you're not sure about what to do with the, in the oversight part. Oh, and here's just one more that I found again on that Facebook page. Um, so this reveals a lot of things, I think. So this executive director wanted to upgrade internet at their office, and the board chair, board president, told her that she had to ask the board treasurer to get board approval for that. And they said because only she was only allowed to do board approved that were in the budget. And she said, but you currently don't have a budget. So then she said she couldn't do it. It's a classic catch-22. So again, some things, this clearly is a case where the board doesn't have the right protocols and procedures in place for them to do their oversight work. They should have an annual budget. They should have approved the annual budget, and they should have clear mechanisms in place to supervise the executive director, and the executive director should be able to manage the budget, the day-to-day operations within the budget. If she can find the money in the budget to upgrade the internet, she should be able to do it without asking the board of directors. And just want to leave you finally with this bit of wisdom, I guess. It really is all about relationships. The relationship between the board of directors, particularly the board chair and the executive director, is a critical relationship. And when it goes well, and when they're working in partnership, it really improves the functioning of the agency, again, and can make your mission much more effective, and you can have that social impact that we are all working for. We all want to make the world a better place, and to put our mission into action, and to really have that social impact. And I guess we'll open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions or comments, or again, any scenarios or conundrums that you might want us to address in terms of your board executive director relationship.
Liz,
Yes.
I will also say that the three of us, do completely understand that this is a very tricky topic. And you might not want to share publicly right now, either by unmuting yourself or putting something in the chat box. We are more than available if you want to email us and discuss any questions, scenarios, what do I do with questions. We're happy to do that with you. We know that some of you might feel a little tricky about putting something in there right now.
Absolutely.
And then the last point I want to make is, Liz, this was great. Thank you so much. I feel like between the three of us, talk about this topic forever and give so many different scenarios and reasons why things can get very tricky and blurred. And so many different personality traits that go into it. But I think the key point to remember is, if you have a very clear CEO evaluation, then you know very specifically what that ED is supposed to be doing. And it's very clear what their job description will be and what you're evaluating that person on. And then as a board member, you will know all of those things are no longer under your roles and responsibility, But what is under your role and responsibility is managing how that person is doing those things. So that is definitely the very, very first place to start. The second place is in order to not allow the CEO to feel overwhelmed by reporting to more than one person, is doing that funnel of communication. So the board funnels into the executive committee. The executive committee funnels into the board chair. The board chair and the ED CEO have direct lines of communication. So everything is funneling through one person so that the CEO feels like they are being managed by this board, and it's coming from the head. So that will take care of, board sending requests and the CEO feeling pulled into 26 different directions. And sometimes those directions are conflicting. So if you can set up that channel of communication, those two things alone will help improve most of this. So
Yeah.
thank you, Liz. Those were great places to start.
Yeah. Great. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I will share with you we've curated several tools for you from different sources. We will be sending you from Vantage Point, a board ED roles quiz and multi-area board self-assessment. So this is two things in one. It's the board self-assessment that I spoke about, and then also this kind of quiz. You can see the start of it right there. Great discussion, point of discussion, and a good way to kind of see where everybody's at and where you might need to strengthen your board governance policies and protocols. And then from board source, there's a board member job description template. You can see that on the right. You can use that as a starting point. If you don't have board member job descriptions, you can adapt that to your agency. And then from the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, there's a nice graphic, kind of a table with functions and roles of the board and CEO, a nice grid that again has function of the board, the chief executive, and then those shared things that you have together. So we'll be sending those out along with the recording. And I think a little survey to ask you how we did today after the webinar. Again, thank you for joining us. We're Capital CFO. And here's some of our nonprofit services. We'll just leave you with this. Some of the things that we have available to nonprofit agencies, and we're happy to talk to you about any of these. And you can reach out to Katie, Sabrina, or me with questions, or again, if you have an issue that you want to have a thought partner for, we're happy to act as thought partner and kind of think things through with you, and then also in a more formal way can offer services to help you with all these different areas: strategic planning, board development, interim ED training, grant writing, outreach, and communication. And then here's our contact information. We're happy to stay on for another minute or two for anyone who might have questions or comments. And if not, we will thank you for being here, and we'll also send you information since you're on our email list now. We'll send you information for upcoming webinars and ED roundtables that we have through the year.